Section 3 of Chapter 2, A New Constitution. Last section, we discussed the Articles of Confederation and how the national government had very little power and the state governments had too much power. We were in a situation where we had 13 states acting like 13 separate countries, and we were on the verge of going to war with each other and breaking up a country that had only been around for about 11 years. So in May of 1787, a group of the most well respected men in the States gathered together in Philadelphia at Independence Hall to find a solution to the government that was slowly falling apart. These men, called delegates, realized they had two options. They could change the Articles of Confederation, or they could create a new constitution. If they changed the Articles of Confederation, they needed 13 out of 13 states to agree to the changes. This was going to be a bit of an obstacle, seeing as how only representatives from 12 of the 13 states showed up to the convention. So they had to go with option B, creating a new constitution. The delegates of the Constitutional Convention are referred to as the Founding Fathers. These were 55 men who represented 12 of the 13 states. Rhode Island was the only state not to send any representatives. The most well known of all the delegates is probably George Washington. He was elected as president of the convention. Strangely enough, he originally wasn't even going to come to the convention, but a number of other delegates said that if George didn't go, they wouldn't either. So he changed his mind and attended. While in attendance, George only spoke twice during the entire convention. Benjamin Franklin was the oldest delegate at the Constitutional Convention. He was 81 years old. He was also very well respected and had spent a lot of time living in foreign countries, so he was familiar with other countries' governments and actually came up with a lot of really great ideas during the convention. And finally, we have James Madison. James Madison would eventually become president of our country, but during the Constitutional Convention, he was known as the father of the Constitution. He made a number of contributions during the convention, and he also kept a secret journal. The significance of the journal is that it kept a record of everything that occurred at the convention. And this was important because the delegates decided to hold their meetings in secret. And since they did that, Madison's journal is the only record we have that lets us know what really happened at the convention, who made what contributions, who had what ideas, what different disagreements occurred. And the journal itself wasn't revealed until after Madison passed away. And ironically enough, he was the last of the delegates to pass away. So when the diary was actually discovered, no one who was in it was still alive. When we talked about the Articles of Confederation, we discussed how it looked like the Continental Congress had written the Articles of Confederation doing the exact opposite of everything that Great Britain's government had done. At the time, were at war, tempers were flaring, and we weren't necessarily thinking logically when writing our first Constitution. When writing the second Constitution, we put a little bit more logical thought into it. And we decided to blend some of the ideas we had had as colonies with some of the things that worked well with the British government. So, for example, we decided to use the idea of a trial by jury from the Magna Carta, which was written in 1215. We also used the English Bill of Rights from 1689. We liked the idea of people being able to petition their government and let the government know what they weren't happy about without fear of consequences. And we thought it was important that if you were convicted of a crime, the punishment you received was fair. And finally, the parliamentary government. Parliament is the legislature or the lawmaking branch of Great Britain's government. It consists of two houses or two parts, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The House of Commons is a group of men who are chosen by the monarch to serve in the government, and the House of Commons is a group of people who are chosen by the citizens of Great Britain. Also, the House of Commons has the position of Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is selected from the political party in the House of Commons that holds the most seats. This should sound a little familiar to something in our government. The biggest weakness with the Articles of Confederation was that the national government had too little power. So, the first priority of the founding fathers was to create a stronger national government. They wanted to make sure the national government was stronger, but they also wanted to make sure that the states had some power as well. So, they developed the idea of federalism. Federalism is the idea of splitting the power between the states and the national government. So, some power had to be taken from the states and given to the national government, but in the end, everybody had some power. They kept the idea of Congress as the legislative branch, but Congress was given more power. Congress was given the power to tax, which, as we know, is very important because no government can function without money. By being able to tax the people, Congress was able to pay off our debts as well as provide services that the people of the country needed. They also were given the power to regulate trade. States were still allowed to make trade agreements with other states, but the national government kept an eye on them to make sure they were conducted fairly. And all trade with foreign countries went between the national government and the foreign country's government. We also instituted a military. We added an army and navy, which we were able to do now that we had some money. And speaking of money, we finally developed a national monetary system so we could get rid of all that confusion of every state having their own money. We also added two more branches to our government to balance out the power so that no one branch had too much power in this new government. The executive branch, which consists of the president, the vice president, and what would eventually be known as the cabinet, was instituted to carry out laws and make sure that the states carried out the national laws. We also created a judicial branch. This consists of the Supreme Court. So we finally had a group of people to interpret laws and make sure they went along with the Constitution, as well as settle any disputes on a national level. Roger Sherman from Connecticut came up with what is known as the Great Compromise. He took the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan and put them together. He looked at the idea of Parliament, which had two houses, and decided, why shouldn't we have two houses? So he suggested that our legislature be bicameral, and one house, the House of Representatives, would have representation based on population. They decided to disregard the whole idea of wealth that made things just too complicated. So the more people you had living in your state, the more representatives your state would receive. And then he applied the New Jersey plan to the Senate, where all the states would be equally represented by two senators. On September 17th, 1787, the Constitution was completed. Not all the delegates were necessarily happy with all the parts of it, but they felt that they had written the best plan that they possibly could. We started out with 55 delegates. On the last day of the convention, there were 42 delegates left. Some had left for personal reasons. Others had left because they just didn't like the idea of having a strong national government, and they didn't want to be a part of it. But of those 42 delegates on the last day, 39 of them signed it. Now, the next step was that the Constitution had to go to the 13 states. There were copies made of the Constitution and sent to the various states so that it could be read to the people of the state and they could vote either in favor of it or against it. They needed 9 of the 13 states to agree to the Constitution in order for it to go into effect. As the Constitution was read to the people of the states, the country split into two groups: the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists were the group of people who favored a strong national government. They had felt that the government had been way too weak under the Articles of Confederation, and that if we continued to operate under that particular constitution, our country was going to divide into 13 separate nations. The Federalists did everything they could to convince people that a stronger national government was necessary. And James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay wrote the Federalist Papers. These papers explained why having a strong national government was important and necessary for our government to be successful. The opposing group was the Anti-Federalists. They feared a strong national government. They were afraid that if we gave strength to the national government, we would end up in the same situation we had been under when we were being ruled by Great Britain. And that defeated the purpose of the Revolutionary War and the Declaration of Independence. They also felt that the Constitution did not protect the rights of the people and the states. The Declaration of Independence had stressed human rights and that everyone was entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. However, the Constitution focused on developing a government, not protecting people's rights. So they demanded a Bill of Rights be added to the Constitution. And as time went on, the Anti-Federalists gained more support. So they had to make another compromise. The Federalists agreed that a Bill of Rights could be added to the Constitution. However, they said that they would not add a Bill of Rights until after the Constitution was ratified. The Anti-Federalists were fine with that as long as a Bill of Rights was added eventually. So between 1787 and 1788, 11 of the 13 states ratified the Constitution. This, of course, was more than enough for the Constitution to go into effect. Only North Carolina and Rhode Island did not sign it by that point. They actually waited and signed it after the Constitution was in effect and the new government was becoming successful. In March of 1789, the new government began. It took a little while to elect House of Representatives members, senators, decide where the capital was going to be, and have a presidential election. So once that was all done, it was decided that New York City would be our nation's first capital. However, the Constitution does state that eventually the capital will be moved to a politically unbiased area. And on April 30th of 1789, George Washington was sworn in as the first president of the United States.